Also a very warm welcome from my side. After what has already been a very rich and informative morning or afternoon here in Germany, I would now like to welcome you to the next session as one of the co-chairs, also on behalf of the Graduate Student Research Group. And as Sebastian Bogenstein just has said, our group has organized the following 2 sessions. So my co-chair colleague Tobias Levens will continue later on. But for now, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Silvia Steininger, who you have seen also already today, who our group has invited to speak now on communication practices of European and inter-American human rights regimes. We are pleased that Silvia has accepted our invitation because our working group also deals with narratives related to human rights politics and human rights violations, especially with regard to representations in visual media and literature in the 20th century. Therefore, communication strategies and also visual communication strategies in human rights politics reflect an important part of our working group's interests. Silvia Steininger studied public law, international law, and political science at the universities of Heidelberg and Amsterdam. She is currently doing her doctorate at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, and works as a research assistant at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg on the topic Under Pressure on the Resilience of Regional Human Rights Regimes in an Age of Backlash. She is also a member of the research group Human Rights and International Relations within the consortium, and her research connects with and focuses on interdisciplinary approaches to international law, the law of international organizations, international courts, human rights, investment law and arbitration, and political theory. She has also published and taught on these topics. Okay, so in order to have enough time for a hopefully lively discussion following her presentation, I would now better leave the floor for Silvia Steininger. And on behalf of the graduate group, thank you very much, Silvia. We are very much looking forward to your talk, and please, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much to Leah. Thank you very much to the organizers. Also, thank you very much to Florian and Tobias for the nice introduction. Contrary to the nice shout out by Janne, I'm not talking on business and human rights today. Also, this was a very, very long day, at least for the Germans of us. Usually this is the day where I ask all the students to do some yoga and some stretches. So feel free to do that. I have absolutely zero problem with that. It's already 8 o'clock. Can you see my presentation? I hope so. So we're continuing with the more empirical side of human rights after, like, I think, a wonderful discussions on critical approaches and questions of human rights and democracy on a theoretical basis. I am very pleased and honored to give you a little bit of an insight of my current PhD research, which is on human rights in an age of backlash. And this backlash, of course, has various phases. We already discussed the backlash, which is faced by Black Lives Matter, for example, anti-feminist backlash, a backlash against human rights in general. But of course, this backlash against human rights in general also focuses, especially in the European and inter-American setting, on the 2 big, massive, very prominent regional human rights courts and regimes, also, of course, to the African regime, but this is not so much the focus of my discussions. So today I want to give you a sneak peek of my research, empirical research based on interviews, what happened in the European and inter-American system in the last 10 years with respect to how those 2 courts, how those 2 regimes have discovered communication as an important instrument to combat this backlash against human rights. I want to start also with 2 examples, just like Janne. I'm also very sorry for the Max Planck takeover you have to suffer today. These are 2 examples, at least, which are in the European media, have raised quite a lot of stir. So on the one side, you see the judge of the European Court of Human Rights, Robert Spano, meeting President Erdogan in Turkey last September. So this was the first time. The judges do public visits all the time. This is very normal, but this was the first time that a judge of the European Court of Human Rights, especially the president, has visited Turkey. And of course, it comes in a time where we see that there is a massive human rights backlash in Turkey. We see thousands of cases currently pending at the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, in that very heightened political climate, Judge Spano went to Turkey, met the president. That is very normal, but also Judge Spano said two other things. He also accepted an honorary doctorate from the University of Istanbul, which had previously in the years before cleansed the students and university teachers from its faculty, which were critical of President Erdogan. And he also visited a regional city, a local city, Mardin, with the respective Turkish judge and met local politicians, which were also related to that respective Turkish politicians. As you can imagine, this caused quite a lot of stir in media and also the academic debates in general, what courts are doing, which kind of messages they're sending, with whom they're meeting, and how they communicate, in particular to countries which are not democratic or have a democratic regression and are openly hostile against human rights in general. We also see here, and that's the other side, the European Court of Justice having its first ever press release in response to a decision by the German Constitutional Court also last year. So usually the European Court of Justice does not respond to other domestic courts decisions, but this was the first time there was a release which said, okay, we do not discuss that, but we kind of do. And I think those two recent examples are exemplary for a change in how human rights courts or international courts in general react and correspond to the publics of the respective states, which of course include also domestic constitutional courts, as in the case of the European Court of Justice. My argument is as follows. First, I argue, and not alone that human rights communicate in diverse and innovative ways today. As lawyers, we usually think that human rights courts communicate through their judgments. There might also be press releases, but that's it. Moreover, we very much often focus on the judges themselves. So what are the judges doing? And that, I think, with the example of Spano, also causes quite a lot of stir. Today, we see most of the human rights courts, international courts in general, they have Twitter profiles, they have Instagram profiles, they have Facebook profiles, YouTube streams, and so on. So very innovative. My second argument, part of the argument, is that there is an increasing importance of communication outreach practices, especially in times of backlash. So especially in times when human rights are under extreme pressure in particular countries or by particular states, we see that there's an increasing importance of communication by the institution as such. And of course, most backlashing states are not democracies. So this again links to our discussions we just had. But of course, backlash also comes from democracies. And then the third part is, I argue that this changes how, why, and to whom the human rights courts communicate. So in the following, I want to give you a sneak peek into three bigger questions. First, communication, second, bureaucracy, and third, instruments and techniques, with a particular focus on questions of visualization and storytelling, just as Leah Bersch has just mentioned, which is of course of interest to many of the PhD students in this group. So institutional communication is something that as political scientists or people interested in public diplomacy have studied for several decades. Institutional communication of courts has very often been neglected because we focus a lot on what the judges are saying, not so much what the court as such speaks. Of course, we hear from Germany and the US where there are different cultures, how the court communicates. In the US Supreme Court, of course, is a very active communicator. The judges are very much well known. This is not so much the case in the German Constitutional Court. For international courts, international institutional communications, we can of course see that this is multifaceted. So it's not just public diplomacy anymore. It's not just about branding the court as a defender of human rights. It's also not just about accessibility and transparency anymore. So just about live streaming or opening up the courtroom. And it's not one-sided anymore. So press releases exist, they still do. But press releases are just one part of the puzzle about how international courts are communicating today. There are various strands of research on international organizations, constitutional courts, and regional courts, and most of those agree that communication in the last 20 years, especially with the rise of digital technology, which we have discussed in earlier presentations today, becomes an important tool of self-legitimation for those institutions. Moreover, Matthias Ecker-Erhardt, a German political scientist, also studied that this politicization, which we currently witness, especially in human rights as well, fuels the creation and professionalization of institutional communication. So we see a move away from the court or the judges speak to kind of the institution as such by professional communicators, professional communication departments are taking over now this official branding, official communication of the courts. I argue that these are particularly important to create loyalty, to create legitimacy in the respective in states which are backlashing. I don't want to go into like the concept of loyalty anymore. It's 8 o'clock. No one wants to hear a lot about theory, but basically where I'm coming from is Albert Hirschman and David Easton about concepts like loyalty or public support or sociological legitimacy. With respect to communication, I see two strategies. On the one hand, I think that communication, proactive, dual, two-sided communication by human rights courts can create awareness about the institution among the general public, so that people are actually aware that, for example, the European Court or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights exists and what it actually does. And second, I believe that communication can strengthen communities of practice through mutual interactive engagement with core constituents. So that means that what we have here is our courts strategically communicating, for example, to particular parts of the society. For example, human rights NGOs, bar associations, civil society activists, and so on. And of course, this is something that there are manifold of examples how this can play out in practice. I did now interviews, so I was interested in how those two institutions, so the European human rights regimes and the Inter-American human rights regimes, thinks about that as well. So this is like an internal paper. So how do they conceive about what they're doing? Who are those people which are communicating, and which kind of instruments are they using? So this is based on interviews at the European human rights system, about the European Court of Human Rights, the Council of Europe, as well as the Committee of Ministers, which monitors the execution of human rights judgments, as well as in the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. I don't see the chat, but probably I should speak slower. I know that. I have basically found out in those interviews first that there's a professionalization in all of those regimes. So the oldest press department we have is actually at the European Court of Human Rights. It's also the biggest, with 11 people working on press releases and communication policies. And the newest is at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which was just established last year. But we see in all of those institutions, we see an increasing also budgetary move towards communication and press departments. And this was what I found from the interviews, also a direct response to rising politicization and instances of backlash, for example, by Russia, which has threatened to cut the funding of the European human rights system. So the people who work there considered this a direct outcome, like an increasing focus on the communication policies, a direct outcome of this backlash by non-democratic states. Moreover, we also see that a move away from lawyers who usually worked on those courts and press offices, to communication specialists as well as journalists. So now we hire a communications specialist to more directly target, for example, core substantive norms, core press releases, and so on. This also means that there's a shift in the language, from the language of the law, a very technical language, how judgments are communicated, to a more accessible language for the general public. Then the question is, okay, does those communications actually affect the expansion of audiences for like the creation of awareness among the general public? And here, of course, both of the courts suffer from massive problems, especially due to language. While the Inter-American Court mostly focuses on Spanish as the main languages and less so in English, it struggles, for example, to do messages in Portuguese, also because of budgetary pressures, as well as French. In the European Court of Human Rights, of course, it's a similar situation, while English and French are like the main languages, where there are also like budgetary possibilities for lots of communication in those languages. It's less so, of course, to most of the other languages of the region. We also see that there is difference in the approach towards communication. While the European human rights system is still very state-centered, so they think that they're talking to the state and the state agents and the state authorities, the inter-American human rights regimes sees victims as the victims of human rights abuses as the main priority of its communication policy. So it sees victims of human rights abuses as basically the main addressees to make victims aware of their mandate of their case, but also they want to highlight the voices of victims in their communication instruments, like videos, press releases, and so on. And I also think that this is relatively successful. So we see, for example, many clicks, visits, and social media engagement, which has doubled or tripled over the last years. Of course, there's also an activation of communities of practice. So all those institutions have identified target groups. Like I said, in the European system, it's mainly legal professionals and state authorities. And in the inter-American system, it's mainly also journalists, as well as victim and civil society activists. But both of those regimes have put a lot of money and capacity also in making the general information more accessible. So we have seen new homepages, new social media accounts, as well as an overhaul of press releases. But it's difficult to assess whether this is actually creating more loyalty among the states. We saw, for example, that there was an outpouring of support after the so-called 5 presidents letter in the inter-American system, as well as after Russia's threat to withdrawal. We saw an outpouring of support by civil society and NGO activists, but it's very difficult to measure that there is a direct causality between those two systems. So, and in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk a bit about storytelling and visualizations, because this was an interesting finding. I hadn't thought about that, but it came up in every interview I had, which was that all the courts, all the institutions want to increase the budget of storytelling and visualization. And I found the following. So institutional communication in this sense follows the visual turn. Visual turn, we have that in human rights activism. No, we all know NGOs. Leah Birch works on that a lot historically also. We also know NGOs, how they use media, how they use photography, how they use video to make people aware of human rights abuses, but also increasingly international organizations are also using visuals like pictures to communicate their mandate and their mission. Of course, there's on the one hand storytelling, which is an emphasis on the human impact and the creation of empathy. On the other hand, there's an increasing use of visual media, which means that the use of videos, clips, cartoon, and pictures. And this is another quote, I will not read it out loud, by an interview which he said, okay, actually, when you're talking about human rights, you need to create empathy. So empathy is the main goal. And for that, we need storytelling and visual media to make people all over the world aware of that, also to overcome the language barrier that we face. How does that work out? So for example, here at the Inter-American system, there is now an increasing emphasis on the storytelling and visualization, even though it has the smallest budget of all the institutions I looked at. The Inter-American Court has put a lot of emphasis on that in the last year. On the one hand, it has developed a new program which is called ABCD, Derechos Humanos. So I like a small cartoon and clip series where they explain in clips of like 1 or 2 minutes in a cartoon level what the court is doing, how you can bring a case against the court, for example here, how are the judges elected and so on. And this is what they basically, it's on a very low level so that even children can understand that. On the one hand, it also included videos now, for example, here on the monitoring of judgments, where they go after a judgment to respective communities and make videos where also the victims have said, okay, this is how the Inter-American Court helped me. This is why the Inter-American Court was important to me. And this is why my life is now. So short videos about the monitoring and the execution of judgments. In the European Court of Human Rights, the thing is more complicated because the European Court of Human Rights has a more traditional approach to media and engagement with the public. However, as you can see in this quote, which I also do not want to read aloud, is that this storytelling direction is something that is debated internally and something that the Council of Europe wants to look for more, because it wants to basically recreate its image. It sees itself under threat, it sees itself under attack, and it found storytelling, narratives, and visualization as an important tool to create, to defend the court and try people to tell stories from a human point of view. For that, for example, last year, they made a whole homepage, which was called on the occasion of the 70 years anniversary of the European Convention on Human Rights, which for the very first time put the victims in the center of the court's discussion of the court's story. So in that homepage, you can look at impact of the ECHR, it's called. They have chosen a particular number of cases according to each country and try to tell the story behind those cases. So here, for example, I had the case of David Norris, which was the one guy who brought down the legalization of homosexuality in Ireland. And here you can see various clips, how David Norris talks about it, and also different other actors making statements about the importance of this particular judgment to the LGBTQI community in Ireland. So trying to recreate that the European Court of Human Rights is not only helping like defending unpopular minorities, but it has an important and significant impact also for human rights of all people in this regard. And there's a variety, they're like around 100 judgments, which the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights Communication Department has found in this new and very accessible format for the general population. And with this, I want to stop. I think my time is up. Just basically ending with this quote, I also found very interesting that if courts don't tell their stories, someone else will. So the increasing importance of communication, especially in times of backlash, is important. I think, in my opinion, is an important element of new strategies to combat human rights backlash in the 21st century. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm